Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves and today we are going green. As always, I'm joined by my co-host and founding member of the new EU Army, PESCO, Martin McMahon.
Yeah, we're the resistance.
No, I swear I saw you leading the charge.
No, I'm the guy like a kilometre back with the 50 cal, just click.
But more importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the tortoise shack by Dail Researcher for the Green Party, climate change consultant and activist Sinead Mercier. Sinead studied at the London School of Economics and Politics and was involved with organisations like Occupy. And she's into consensus building organisations, which is something that really got my attention. Sinead, thanks so much for coming on to the podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me in. I'm delighted. Have listened to your podcast and it's really, really interesting. Mary McAuliffe and Glenn Fitzpatrick and so on. So delighted to be here.
It was a real window into Twitter because I think I went on a slight rant, a small thread about climate change, and Leo had given a speech that he was going to. Rather than pay fines for missing our 2020 climate targets, he was going to try and put money into actually trying to achieve them. And this is on the back of spending years of saying we weren't going to make the targets. We've already admitted that for the previous number of years. And I went on a bit of a rant, and Peter Kavanagh came in and said, "You got to get Sinead in." Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, here we are. So there's so for all the ills I speak of social media, that there's great parts of it too. So I suppose we just kick us off, Martin.
Well, thanks very much for coming in, and we've had a little chat before, and Tony and I are so impressed. We are so impressed, and we can't say that out loud, but we are. Tony's in the London School of Economics scared Tony a little, and I'll be honest about this.
I'm very flattered.
So, tell us, where is Ireland on climate change? Where do we officially stand as compared to where we actually are?
Well, Ireland is a laggard on climate action. That's something quite spoken about quite often. We're doing actually quite well when it comes to renewable energy. The type of system that we have is changing quite dramatically, and we're using more wind in the system and so on rather than fossil fuels. But overall, Ireland is again missing climate targets again and again, and this is mainly due to agricultural emissions and also to transport, and finally as well when it comes to buildings too. So we need to radically decarbonise our buildings, our transport, and also look at perhaps different ways of managing our agriculture as well. So that's what Ireland is responsible for under its government targets, and there's also an EU emissions trading scheme, which is private industry, which is something very interesting that I'd like to speak to as well, because that's something often let out of the debate. We're often looking at Ireland in terms of what is the Irish government doing on these sectors, but something that's overlooked is private industry, especially offshore oil and gas, which is a privatised industry. So.
And you've done a lot on oil and gas, I take it. You've done quite a lot on oil and gas.
Yes, on offshore oil and gas in particular. It's just something I find very interesting because Ireland's climate, a lot of climate talk in Ireland has focused very much on transport and those areas I spoke about, but it is kind of an industry that's left. If you look at who is actually causing climate change, only 80 entities are responsible for it in the last 200 years, and those are like ExxonMobil, your usual kind of Shell oil,
big oil and
big gas, and ExxonMobil, for example, knew about climate change back in the 1970s, and actually even prepared educational presentations for school children that they were going to show in schools all around America. And they decided at some point in history not to use all the massive wealth they have to, promote a new and different green system, but instead collude with other oil and gas organisations who have caused this problem to hide the information. And Naomi Klein has done massive work looking at the sponsorship of climate deniers in the US and other countries. And that's where we are here today. So I just think that we need to focus on them more, They're getting 500 billion in subsidies every year, if not $1 trillion. And
there's an interesting thing that I often find is very funny, where people talk about how politics and climate collide. If you remember when Syriza came in to power in Greece, one of their pledges was they were going to stop the drills because there was drills going in a national park, and they said we're going to stop the drills. And I sat in front of, as close to Martin is now, I was sitting in front of Yanis Varoufakis, and he explained at one stage that when they stopped the drills, they still had enough money to go for another few months to
ride it out.
To ride it out, ride out the storm. But big oil and big gas kicked the crap out of behind doors with the ECB, and they said, turn off their money now. Don't. And so that's not really spoken about, how the corporates actually leaned on and they played a part in what happened there as well. Insofar as, like, you know, we had horrible things that were said, you know, who speaks of Syriza now and all that sort of nonsense. But there was but the big corporates actually played a big part in that.
Yeah, and like you're totally correct. Like there's an amazing book out by Amanda Slevin. She's actually got a talk in Galway, I think, this weekend. She wrote a book called Oil, Gas and the Irish State, and it just looks at exactly what you're talking about. The fact that we have this kind of, and speaking on consensus as well, you have this kind of global shift to neoliberalism, in which organisations like Syriza or many kind of traditionally left parties and groups, even when they actually get into the department dealing with oil and gas, they basically have no power over where it's directed, because the kind of the guiding ideology just swoops everybody along with them. And her book is very interesting, looking at the Department of Petroleum Affairs in Ireland, and how their kind of links to the oil and gas industry, that they are the regulator when it comes to the legal protection of our environment, and the regulatory manner in which oil and gas should be extracted or explored for, and yet they're also supposed to be dealing with giving out the licenses, and they're also supposed to promote the oil and gas industry. So you have this department which has all these conflicting duties, and the question is, you know, do you focus on the minister who goes in there for what, like a 3-year term, or do you focus on the department itself and focus on the overriding global ideology that oil and gas is all that we should be drilling for or looking after? So does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. But I suppose the question I have is, who gets it right? Because, you know, I always see the Norwegian put up there as this huge green country, but they did make their money. Their pension retirement fund is in the sea, and they extract it. But everybody drives a Tesla. So you know, is a Tesla just to salve their guilt, or are they actually getting it right now? Are they doing it more efficiently, and are they doing things that we probably should be mimicking?
Yes, I see. This is that's why kind of just transition is such a helpful framework. Like the reality is that oil and gas especially, is only about $50 a barrel. We put in a number of parliamentary questions to the department, asking them what their kind of foresight, what they expect oil to rise to per barrel, and oil and gas is really only profitable to exploit from the Irish Sea at €100 a barrel, $100 a barrel, but it's only around 50. And you can see that now there's mass layoffs of jobs, 450,000 jobs lost since middle of 2014 in the North Sea. Yeah, it's just plummeting.
And can a green economy replace those jobs?
A green economy can, but the problem is that you're having there's not enough money is being put into the alternatives. Like, for example, now even the Irish government, the only jobs that it's looking at in terms of the Department of Petroleum Affairs is scholarships for geo drilling, so drilling our seabed, and also jobs in scholarships to look at the oil and gas industry and how we can promote it further. And the question is, like, why isn't that money being used to promote, like, say, offshore wind, which now floats? You know, you can get floating offshore winds projects. In Scotland now, they've done massive work looking at how to transition their workers. They've lost 120,000 jobs already in the North Sea, and the government they've exploited oil, and this is kind of we thought that oil and gas wasn't as dangerous as it has turned out to be in recent years. So the question is, what do you do with that information? That kind of, what, Keynes, is it?
Keynes,
he said, when the facts change,
I
change too. Yeah. And it's when you know that oil and gas is as dangerous as it is and is contributing to as much damage as it is, why not pump the money that you have now into a new industry and researching that new industry? So that's kind of the question of where we're going. And that's what just transition lends to.
But I think maybe our listeners would benefit just getting the idea of what just transition is actually.
Yeah, great.
Wouldn't give us a bit of background on it?
Okay, so just transition is something fought for very hard by trade unions and environmentalists together. So it's this idea that when you move from a carbon-based economy, one where you have people working in coal plants, where trade unions have built up an awful lot of strength, for example, in the peat plants in Ireland, and when you move to a green economy, you don't just leave people behind and say, well, all your jobs are gone, sorry, that's it. That's a very kind of neoliberal way of thinking. It's treating people as resources, people that can just be left aside. Instead, you bring them with you and you pump money into transitioning them into a new economy. And it's in the Paris Agreement in 2015, in the preamble it says that when governments are moving to a clean economy or decarbonising their energy systems, they must put in support for social welfare, transition, new jobs, and look at also regional support for people. So a great example is what happened when Thatcher apparently, liberalised the UK system, and she just left all those miners, like all their jobs, and their communities just fall by the wayside. Those kind of economic restructurings, and like the IMF view was that, well, rising tide lift all boats. It's fine to leave whole communities behind because generally the country will be doing better in terms of its GDP. And that is not a healthy framework. It treats people as resources. It treats our planet as...
It's where we are. It's where we are currently in our current economy.
It is
we
very
have
much.
We have the highest. We've had the highest tax take in the history of the state, and yet the fastest growing wealth inequality. So
yeah. They are a 26.3% jump in tax in 2015. And it's mad.
So where does Ireland need to go with its green policy now? Blatantly, what's been happening hasn't worked. So
has anything been happening?
So we're about solutions here. So what's the way forward? Where do we go?
Well, Scotland is actually a very good model. They have they have actual specific targets for community energy. So you have to reach this amount of. Not only do you have to reach this amount of renewables in your energy system, but you also have to make sure that a good proportion of it actually isn't just owned by large multinational investors, but is owned by ordinary people. And they also have specific climate targets as well. Like in Ireland, we, other than what the EU tells us to do, we're not developing our own targets, and that's a big problem. It just gives people a goal point to aim towards and to work towards. And that the National Mitigation Plan is described as something that will be constantly updated. So it makes it very difficult for people who work in renewable energy or who are trying to get Ireland to do more on climate to actually have concrete proposals that it can aim to. And you can see that in the Climate Action Low Carbon Development Act, which was apparently the saviour on climate action. It was this new bill brought in, but it's completely open to the government just has to present these national mitigation plans or national adaptation plans and present them every year, and that's kind of it.
It's a holding pattern. It just keeps it there.
Yeah, there's nothing concrete that you can hold to. There's talk. There's actually a climate law case, being taken by a group of academics in UCD and a few others, and they're hoping to kind of use tort law, saying that future generations are going to be damaged irreparably by the government's lack of action at the moment. But cases like the Urgenda case, which was taken in the Netherlands, that had kind of more concrete targets. The government has to reach these targets. But what the government is doing is it's trying to avoid any responsibility for its emissions by saying, well, we don't have a specific emissions target.
But is that because Ireland's economy or agriculture is such a huge part of Ireland's economy?
Yes, and that's kind of there's a lot of lobbying going on from the Irish Farmers Association.
No.
So yes, yeah.
Leo tweeted this week, I am a champion of the people who get up early in the morning, self-employed, and it was.
Genius.
But who was it given to? Who was the speech aimed at? The IFA.
Oh yeah,
it was purely
stable genius, up early.
Yeah.
Get the reputation of being an early riser.
You can lie on
and
all
you
your
can
days.
lie on all day.
Yeah. It's the IFIA, they don't really represent. They represent large farmers with large tracts of land, people who are engaged in the dairy and beef industry primarily. There's kind of this. I was on the Claire Burns show about farming.
Right.
And
Don't watch it.
don't watch it.
I saw you on the Claire
Oh,
Burns
did you?
show.
Oh God. I didn't. I had my hand up. I was sitting next to Ray Burke, who's like a known climate denier with Met Éireann. But anyway, yeah, it's kind of
Nothing
it's,
to the previous Ray Burke that we all know of, no.
Oh yeah.
Less
that's
said the
another
better.
bad- yeah.
Moving swiftly on.
Yeah, that's actually something interesting as well. If you want to talk about the tax take, like we're destroying our environment and destroying the climate for like.
Please, the floor,
one of the-
Firehead, let us know. Well, if it doesn't make money, if it doesn't make sense financially.
Yeah. That's
Now
the
we
question.
did this with the series we're doing on housing, that it doesn't make sense financially to have the situation the way it is. It's a politics of spite.
Currently the most expensive method of housing people is emergency accommodation, and and it's the highest growing area of emergency accommodation. Clearly, things like as you said, extracting oil that is costing you $100 to take out of the sea and can sell for 50. That's not financially viable, even though big oil believe it is, because they're currently fracking away in other places, in other parts of the world. And then the other side of it is obviously things like in Ireland, we boast that we produce enough food to feed 50 million people in a small little country of 4.5 million. Or 6 million if we take the island as a whole, and we do. But when you look at it from that perspective, that we still have food poverty, yet we produce all this food, and then we have export food, and we talk food miles, we talk transport, and we talk all that sort of stuff. So, realistically, where are we getting? Are we getting enough money from that industry? Realistically, like you were saying, the tax take high enough from it?
Ireland's tax take for oil and gas is one of the lowest in the world. It's no longer like the lowest because they've changed it recently.
Oh, come on, who's lowest? Tell us who's. Give us what ballpark are we in? It's okay. No. Yeah, we'll tweet it up. We'll tweet it up. People, tell us who's the lowest. We'll tweet it up later on, or somebody will tell us.
Yeah, so Ireland's tax take is 25%. However, that can be written off against any costs that you've racked up when you've been exploring for oil and gas.
Heard this.
So like Carb now, for example, we're unlikely. There's reports that we're unlikely actually to get anything from Carb until very, very late in the day, any tax revenue. But the focus, same with housing, it's kind of this focus of farming out any action on any direct state involvement and just allowing private industry to do it.
Oh yeah.
And like you can see it for housing. I'm sure you had Mel Rennans in and looking at the figures there from local authorities.
It's actually hyper neoliberalism is what it is, really hyper neoliberalism. I mean, selling off stuff that just doesn't make sense to sell off.
Yeah, and like, I don't know, did you read, there's an interesting article from Megan Nolan. I suppose it's kind of a neoliberal point of view collated with kind of post-colonial, like, unwillingness to be involved or kind of a lack of self-esteem. Like the fact that Amanda Slevin has looked at this, that like the government has not bothered to build up experience within our natural resources departments and expertise in those departments. Instead, it's constantly farmed out to industry and for private industry to take control. And the reasoning there is, there's nothing there. There's a 1 in 7 chance of finding oil and gas in Norway, a 1 in 3 chance of finding it in the UK, and a 1 in 32 chance of finding it off the Irish shore. So obviously then we need a very attractive tax regime. We barely should tax these people at all because, there's nothing there. But then if there's nothing there and if we're not going to get anything from it, if we do go there, then why not just ban the whole thing altogether and preserve our fisheries, preserve our tourism, and preserve, the climate in general. So
it's zero sum, really.
Yeah.
There's nothing to be gained from going in there.
Yeah, no, nothing to be gained really. There's so for example now in the Porcupine Basin, there's been a lot of seismic studies and in the Porcupine Basin in 2015, the government sponsored a number of kind of programs to look at our sea floor, and they found that we actually have one of the most beautiful and pristine water coral reefs in that area, something that's never been found before. And like this is an area
That's a cold water.
cold water coral reef.
Yeah, no, I haven't heard it, because now I was watching something recently where the reefs are dying off because of a rise in temperatures.
Yeah, but no, Ireland still has this beautiful, healthy coral reef, and it's fantastic, you know. And this was all found, and in the same year, the government granted licenses to drill in the same area, and they're doing seismic testing as well. So the government in 2014, 2015 sponsored they spent 20 million, in league with a group called ENI. Who are another oil company who have very dodgy links to an awful lot of human rights scandals in Nigeria again. And they, with the government, ENI and the government, they sponsored this programme to map in 2D format the ocean floor, and spent 20 million on it. 20 million that could be spent on innumerable renewable energy projects or offshore wind.
It just reminds me of so much of when, if you remember, there was, I think they were called the Black Hills, and it was in the States when the
Dakota.
The poor old Native Americans had this, and when the lads went up to, when the soldiers were going through to visit them to see if they were staying within their remit, they spotted all the gold in the river. And they thought, oh, we need to get them out of there. Yet we've actually done a deal. The president has signed off. This is their land, and we need something to get them out. And someone came up with this phrase, a great phrase that they used, they stole it from the Bible nearly, manifest destiny. That, you know, it's ours the earth is ours to take what we want from it. And manifest destiny has become corporatized, it's become neoliberalized, or whatever you want to talk about it. And it comes to the point where when you're saying we're scanning the seabed, because there's a mindset there that says, that's ours to actually extract from it. And whether you believe it's because some deity gave it to us, or it's in a book, or you believe it because your deity is actually the almighty dollar, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, like something shocking, like it's I think sometimes you should, if you're working on green issues or any social issues, they should give you free therapy. I found out that the world's population of dolphins is 250,000, and they come every winter to Ireland to come to our seas in winter, and yet we're conducting the seismic testing that deafens whales and kills krill and dolphins for miles beyond, you know. And it's just, as you say, the kind of the NPWS and National Parks and Wildlife in Ireland, they don't look at protecting whales completely. It's kind of like, well, a few whales and a few dolphins, blue whales, even a protected species, they should be killed in pursuit of oil and gas exploration, even if there's only a 1 in 30 chance of finding anything with the seismic testing that happens. And it's that sort of mindset that profit is king, money is king, and all other things must be entered into that framework. And something interesting happening too is that we have this thing called natural capital now. So it's this idea that GDP cannot account for what are called externalities. So externalities are things like there might be plenty of jobs and people in employment, but the quality of those jobs and the fact that people might be suffering, you know, severe mental stress or severe work stress, 0-hour contracts, that's not counted in GDP. So we have almost full employment, but the ICTU have told us that 8% of those jobs are very, very low quality. And also another externality is the planet that we live on, the planet which gives us life. The fact that the air that we breathe is not computed within our GDP, which is an absolutely maddening situation. And what economists are starting to do now is it's starting to say, well, let's enter that air we breathe, or that sea that we get fish from and food from, into the GDP framework. So let's compute it up and rationalise it and say, well, the sea costs 10 billion a year to the Irish economy, which is crazy, you know, when you think about it. I mean, what sort of framework says that a human person is worth, you know, like 100 million a year to somebody, or would it even be that much?
No, it's 3 million in the air industry.
Yeah.
I tell you, if you're accidental death, the payment starts at, in the UK, about £21,000. So that's the price of a life.
Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. Farmers actually have the most dangerous job in Ireland, which is something like that kind of that class thinking about climate change should take into account.
Well, you're right there. It
dangerous to
should
your
take
farmer,
into account that these guys die.
Yeah, they do. Slurry pits, like the damage, like, no, a farmer knows just as damaging as how damaging greenhouse gases can be, because, the rate of deaths and breathing in fumes from a slurry pit and drowning, it's massive, But that, like as you said, that kind of framework about GDP thinking, that was there's a really interesting book called by Silvia Federici, and she looks at how that framework of thinking was forced. It was a brutal transition to the type of world that we have, which involves the witch hunts. It involves rooting out kind of alternative perspectives of the world that we live in, and how they are not considered productive. Like, what is productivity, and how productivity and profit, which is the end result of productivity, is the only framework in which a human being or the world that we live in can be computed. And it's something very fascinating and something very deep in thinking.
I can hear people shouting, people who shout at my articles on Broadsheet going, yeah, but the Gini index will tell you...
right, leave that one to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
They'll shout that at us and tell us that because of things like, that in this capitalist society, in this model of how we work things, we also have social transfers, and sure, we have incremental improvements. Now, of course, they'll say, and the reason we regress is just because of the global financial crisis and everything will be grand in the next little while. My argument to that would be, the global financial crisis, we're just back in another cycle of it again,
That's
folks.
right,
And if we don't cop on and actually learn, we'll just repeat the same mistakes. But at the same time, we had Owen O'Brien in, and he spoke about, when we spoke about houses, he actually pulled me up and said I wasn't being ambitious enough, and people don't need houses, they need communities, they need homes. And likewise, like that, it's about, so yes, sadly, everything can be reduced to a number on a page. It can.
It is. Whether it's done properly or not is a different question.
But it's about taking that model and actually making something that improves the well-being and the air you breathe and the water you drink.
Well, that's a generational asset, really. How do you measure it over one lifetime? You can't really. You've got to measure it over a billion year cycle. How do you measure something that's going to be around long after you're mush?
Yeah. And this is the Earth will be there. It will adapt. It's the question: can we adapt fast enough?
Well, I always think it's kind of an arrogance when people say the Earth will end. No, the Earth won't end. You will. The Earth will tip along quite nicely without you. It did before you. It will after you. So, if you want to be on it, get your act together.
Yeah. Things are not that depressing. And I've just come from the Dáil, and we had the repeal the 8th, Fianna Fáil, Micheál Martin standing up and giving that talk, and Céad O'Connell from Fine Gael, parties you'd never expect to be kind of so supportive of women's rights and change. So there is a movement happening, and you can see it with other political parties on climate change as well. Lynn Boylan in Sinn Féin has been fantastic. All the anti-fracking work they've done.
Yes.
She's so dedicated on water as well. And there you have this kind of, when you have different people, whether they're women or LGBT, QI, and they're all kind of, when they contribute to politics changes and becomes more diverse. And that is and Breed Smith as well with People for Profit. She's also been fantastic. Their policy used to be that we use the 10 billion barrels of oil in the Irish Sea to bring Ireland out of austerity, the alternative to austerity. 10 billion barrels of oil would have been all the carbon Ireland is allowed to emit twice over forever. So we would have burnt the planet, So, but Breed Smith has been amazing and is now doing a bill on Keep It in the Ground to stop offshore and onshore oil and gas and coal extraction until we've stopped, hitting too high a climate target. The Green Party have a bill in as well called Keep It in the Ground, doing the same. So there is a big sea shift happening,
And where do you see the Greens in the Irish political spectrum? because every party has stolen the Greens' clothes a little bit. Everybody has.
Yeah.
So what now sets the Greens apart from the other parties?
Well, I've had chats with Ed Davitt, who I work with, who worked in Brussels for an awful lot, and I think like there's absolutely no harm in people stealing clothes. I mean, the whole point of the Green Party was set up after the Berlin Wall. It was set up in the 70s in Germany and in other countries to kind of look at peace and pacifist approach to politics, and looking at making sure it's mainly climate activists. The Green Party in Ireland was the Feminist Party and the Ecology Party coming together, uniting their beliefs to basically like remove themselves. If you get me, like feminism isn't there to always be or have to be around, because if you always need feminism, then women are always going to be second-class citizens.
Okay.
So the point of green politics is the same. It's a movement that will end itself because it's no longer needed. It will
So
be
its
mainstream.
ultimate success is its own end.
Yes, exactly.
Welcome to our utopia.
So, yeah, it's to say here's a door to utopia. So, and that's the kind of Ed Davitt was saying that, you know, you need a Green Party always, because people might steal clothes, but at the end of the day they might shed them when it comes to something, when push comes to shove on something, because you'll always have like the Labour Party connected to a particular trade union, and that particular trade union's beliefs must be promoted above others, and maybe green issues don't stand in that way. So there'll always be a role for such parties, and I think the green movement in Ireland as well is fascinating. Like, it's so... Hilary Tovey did a sociological study of it and how it shifted over the years from, like... do you want to go into this?
Yeah,
Okay.
please, yeah.
So this is all the... everything but climate targets. But, yeah, she did this fascinating study. I did my thesis in the London School of Economics on fairy forts, and
Right.
so...
And Danny Healy-Rae.
Yeah, and Danny Healy-Rae, exactly. Like, I don't agree with him on Repeal the Eighth, but on his fairy forts I do agree with him. And he, it's very interesting in Ireland the way that fairy forts are treated. They are, if you talk to, like, I called up one of the Gardaí who actually reported the farmer who destroyed a fairy fort.
I remember that, yes.
And it was the first case in 2012 on this new legislation being tested on protecting national monuments, and the farmer was brought to court because the guard said he destroyed a fairy fort. Yeah. So that was his language. He spoke to me on the phone and he was like, yeah, it was awful what he did. He destroyed a fairy fort.
Oh yeah, that man's never going to have any luck whatsoever, ever.
Yeah.
Why would you do it?
Yeah, why would you do it? And that is a real belief. Whether you believe in fairies or not is beside the point. The question is, are people avoiding fairy forts or protecting fairy forts because they believe in the existence of fairies, or something that could be described fairies, whether it's an animistic belief in land and protection of land or whatever it is. And yet the legislation in environmental law and EU law only reads and sees fairy forts as ring forts. So they're described as something which isn't in keeping with the cultural beliefs of the people
they're not
around
ring
them.
forts.
They're not ring forts. And sometimes a fairy fort isn't a ring fort.
Oh,
it's
my
just a
granddad
mound,
was clear on
you know?
that. No, they are not. And you don't mess with them. You simply
No, you don't mess with them. No, Super Quinn, wasn't it? The collapse of Super Quinn was because he raised a fairy fort. Yeah.
You're not going to tell me my house is on an Indian burial
fairies
ground
took
now.
down the neoliberals. I love it.
Well, it's really interesting. Like, Foucault has this kind of article called Heterotopias and Utopias, and it's about kind of the dominant ideology and how there are things that exist in neoliberalism, as an example, that just buck the trend and say, no, your ideology does not apply here. It cannot apply here. So the utopia of neoliberalism is probably like me and you are like person 90210 and we are worth like $2,000 each or something like that.
Well, that's about $1,999 more than me or Tony are worth.
Speak for yourself.
Beverly Hills 90210. I realised I said
Yeah,
that.
I let it go.
I don't know why this is in my head, but anyway. And but then like something like a fairy fort, or even love and family, buck the trend that you can't compute them. You know, you can't compute a fairy fort. It's not. It doesn't add anything to the state in terms of tourism. Really, like it doesn't add anything to the state in terms of monetary worth, because farmers will avoid it even if it means that they're like a quarter of their field is unusable, you know. So these things do exist and they are real, and the question is in environmental law in Ireland, which is believed to come with only the EU, why were these ferry forts protected for millennia? And it was farmers that protected them, even if it meant with entry into the EU and the Common Agricultural Policy, they lost out because they wouldn't get money for like extra productivity of that land. Yet still that trend remained protected, and like the environmental movement previously in Ireland used to be very much focused on EU law, and most Irish people are NIMBYs and bungalow blitz, and we love destroying the environment and making loads of money, kind of boorish people, and like the idea that it was Europe that educated us, and Hilary Tovey does this fantastic alternative view of Ireland and looks at Sore Point and looks at Corrib and looks at all these places where people like use these descriptions of land that were not, kind of environmental law or computable in terms of capitalist rhetoric, and like for example now in Corrib, one of the farmers who was jailed, he said that he was offered subsidies for protecting the corn creek, and he was like, why would I need money to protect a corn creek? It's just something I would do anyway. And
that's interesting, because the other thing that bothers me greatly, and I don't know, maybe I'm going off on a huge tangent here, but when you talk about subsidies for things, I always think of the model now of buying carbon credits, assuaging your national shame by buying a field in somewhere in Africa and saying that we buy that and we can actually offset it against the damage.
People, that was a trend for a little while.
It is.
Yeah.
When I'll just use an example, when our Taoiseach Leo Varadkar was in his private jet with the nice leather calf seats.
Does he have a private jet?
The government has a private jet. Oh, you want to say it's good. He did a lovely piece from the private jet about austerity, and it just got people.
He recorded a video on the jet on his way to Davos, I think it was. So it couldn't have been any worse. There was a great. There was a brilliant tweet on Davos this week. I can't. What's the at Minnie Melange?
Sinead Mercier.
Did you see the tweet she put up? I think she's going to Davos in some capacity to speak.
Yeah.
But the picture she put up was the picture of two pink fluffy snow boots with the crane logo from Aldi, and I just thought, got on my way to Davos to the World Economic Forum with my little crane, and I just thought that's brilliant. There's your world in a nutshell.
For a while, it was trendy to offset your journey in your private jet by
buying.
I planted a few seeds, guys. I'm just like, Jesus.
I know,
it's unreal.
And it's difficult because, people travel more and people should be perfectly allowed to take holidays and so on. But like the fact that carbon offsetting regime is like it's part of the EU. It's part of that natural capital idea. It's that idea that you can compute the world, and as you said, like it can be good for practical reasons. I'm all for pragmatism, but the EU ETS, the EU emissions trading scheme, is how we calculate all our private emissions. So private industry, when they release carbon emissions, and there's like this regime of offsetting what you produce and so on. And a lot of developing countries call this carbon colonialism. They say it's a repeat of colonization because the carbon that's left in the world that can be produced should be produced and held and only used by countries that haven't been able to develop sufficiently.
So it's developing countries.
Yeah, developing countries, or even in Ireland. If the Irish government is going to, well, not the Irish government because the EU ETS applies only to private industry, but if there is carbon that's allowed in the world, it should be used to build social housing. It should be used to ensure that people have plenty of food. It should be used to bring people out of poverty with the current system that we have until we build a system that can be non-carbon. And
so things like changing your mobile phone every 6 months, those are the things that need to take a back seat.
Yes, and like the question is like it shouldn't be really up to individuals. I mean, like I'm all for kind of like Mary Robinson talks about this a lot as well, is that what we need is a regime change led by government. We need the kind of New Deal program. We need governments to stand up and say, no, this is what you're going to have to do. This is what you're doing, and you're not the government, corporate industries can't do this thing of what's it called again, when you false obsolescence. Oh my God, planned obsolescence.
Planned obsolescence. Yeah,
Planned
which is
big at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, massive. Like you see, Apple are being taken to court now because the iPhones that they were producing.
They're admitting they were admitting they
Yeah.
were slowing them down deliberately to force people to get new phones. It's so funny because when you talk about things like Orwellian 1984 and you think about that and you go, and that was supposed to be the mindset of kicking the left in a way, you know, and kicking this sort of stuff, and you go, well, actually, it's been programmed into capitalism that we need a consumerist culture.
Yes,
we need I think years ago when David McWilliams wrote The Pope's Children, he spoke about an aspirationalist society in America. They called it the American Dream. They had the guy who wrote the American Dream was actually...
We call it early risers these days.
But this is it.
But that's honest to God. That's the same thing.
It's a mindset, and it comes down to a simple mathematical thing where when you take the bulk of it out of it, it's almost beggar thy neighbour in many a way. Yeah. Because ultimately, you know, if we're going to do this on carbon, we're as you said, colonial
carbon colonialism.
Yeah, well, I think that's a brilliant term because you know, because what happened in some of the people who they bought these corporations bought their carbon and then people went into their hunting lands in a country far away and found out they couldn't go in because it was now owned by evil HQ back in Texas who were paying for it, you know, and you know, so
but also, sorry for jumping in, Tony, another thing you told us earlier was that you were actually a bona fide activist. You were a member of the Occupy movement.
Yes, I was in LSE. So that was I was in the Marxist Society, and I had a great friend there as well who brought me along to a couple of planning events, and then suddenly he was like, "Well, make sure that you have your bike lock, and we're going to go lock the room of the department, and we're going to take over the university in protest against the type of economics they were teaching in the London School of Economics." And like, to be fair, now the type of it wasn't the most radical of demands that we had. I mean, really, like the Queen of England had actually come the previous year and given out to the economics department saying, well, why didn't you predict the crash? You know, why didn't you address the type of economics that you're teaching? Like Joseph Stiglitz, that book Capital that's out as well.
Yes.
Thomas Piketty, like so many kind of very centrist, very middle of the road, highly regarded economists have just completely torn apart neoliberalism. You know, it just this idea that you shouldn't have state involvement in things or democratic involvement in things and allow the market to run rampant is just insane. It's madness. And so that was the Occupy protest was based around those ideas that, like feminist economics, environmental economics, anything that computed externalities like women's care work or the environment or like the quality of jobs.
I'm obsessed with behavioural economics, as Martin knows.
Even behavioural economics. I mean, behavioural economics isn't included. It's just the fact that you get situations like Enron where like toxic masculinity mixes in with people's choices over shareholdings, and they say they refuse to admit that they're wrong, you know, that type of thing that happens, and then you get like the collapse of Enron because of it, and so those kind of those subjects.
It was mirrored here in the economic crash of the banks here. The same culture was mirrored, you know.
Yeah.
And we even heard the tapes.
Deutschland, über alles.
Yeah, you know, when you look at that toxic culture that does exist, and that toxic culture is it's bred into people from birth.
And those things aren't taken into account, and that's what the Occupy thing was. It was like, look, all these things are treated as side subjects to the main type of economic, like the planning for the year. You know, the type of subjects that a typical economics student takes do not include externalities. You know, so why is that being addressed? And there was also other things about the fact that there was an awful lot of police on campus, and the fact that kind of divestment as well. The university invested not in Israeli goods. It invested in an awful lot of arms trade, as well as like fossil fuels. So that those were part of the demands as well. And it was just wonderful. Like, it was such a big eye opener for me in terms of consensus structures, as you were saying. Like,
and would you find a big difference, we'll say, from the London School of Economics to universities and colleges in Ireland for the level of activism, the level of participation?
Yeah, like, well, now I came from Trinity in 2008 to 2012, so it was very different. I think it was completely depoliticized. I don't remember much. Like, you went to rallies for like repeal was kind of not repeal, but that wasn't, the law wasn't brought in just yet. But there was kind of like the Gender Society. And I went to like from the rivers to the sea, Palestine will be free, and but like, it was very, politics. I really value that change even in myself to becoming an activist, because I understand what it's like to come from. I don't know if you read Oh My God, What a Complete Ashling, but that's me. And
no, but I'm going to put it on the list. Oh my
important
God.
cultural reference.
I'm actually going to take a note of that.
But so that change in a person to going and putting bike locks on doors and going up to anti-fracking protests in Antrim, like, that's it just kind of, it was a real eye opener for me.
It's empowering.
It is. It's empowering. The fact that you can change things,
yes.
that your voice matters. And that's how Occupy was laid out. It was like everybody in the room, no matter what your background, no matter what you might be studying or political affiliation you had before, when you came into that room, you as a person were valuable. It wasn't just politicians. It wasn't just professionals. It wasn't just the doctor, the priest, or the lawyer. And like, that a young person in a country such as Ireland, which promotes like Glenn Fitzpatrick spoke about it quite often, Ireland is based on a pressure valve of letting people emigrate.
Yeah.
And coming from where we were being told that young people are just sitting and watching flat screen TVs, that's what they're spending their social welfare money on. Like, that time, I graduated into the recession with a first class honours and couldn't find work anywhere. And the looking at politicians who were from parties that should have been promoting my concerns and telling me that I was just something useless watching flat screen TVs, it's just horrific.
And they call these things labour activation mechanisms by kicking the young.
Well, since we're on the subject of witch hunts, you actually know quite a bit about witch hunting, don't you?
Yes, yeah. Like, actually, yeah. Ireland's actually quite unique in that, which is why I've hoped for kind of green values. But Ireland actually didn't have any witch hunts. We
didn't.
Two,
and wasn't it just one trial? Isn't that? There
was one trial, and it was a.
That was the one online a few weeks ago.
It was.
I'm only messing. Go on.
This was
witch
up
hunts.
north, actually, wasn't it?
Yeah, men on Twitter appropriating the witch hunt. Yeah, but anyway.
I just got put down there.
No. I like.
I'm only messing.
The sting of that slap will hurt him for ages.
Lovely people.
But it was up north, wasn't it? It was. I think it was. I read it recently.
I can't remember if it was north, but it was a plantation anyway, and it was a Presbyterian group, and one of the women, I think she'd killed maybe 4 of her husbands, or, well, not killed, but they've died, and she was inheriting all their money, and the local priest was getting very annoyed, or minister, and others, and they sparked this rumour that she was a witch, and she escaped just in time, but her Irish maid was burnt.
Oh, God.
So it was, but
there generally wasn't a whole lot of witch hunting in Ireland. Not that overt witch hunting. Like, they still witch hunted in a way. Women were very much.
Oh yeah, like there was. I'm sure misogyny was there, but there was another burning of Bridget Cleary, which is a very fascinating book by Angela Burke, and it's just it's an amazing book if you can get your hands in it. And she just tracks I used a lot of her work for the exploration of ferry forts and environmental law I did, and she looked at how like ferry suspicions or superstitions, it's just kind of another language that this was like just before the famine, so it was a time when English It was used in the papers at the time as an example of this woman was burnt. She was believed to be a changeling by her husband, and really it was a domestic violence case. The husband was jealous of the woman kind of rising up and doing quite well as a seamstress. And it was used in the Irish papers as an example of how the Irish were brutes and, backward and shouldn't be allowed to get independence and should be treated cruelly. And the dominant rhetoric at the time was, again, the economic liberalism before we had neoliberalism. And you can see in the Irish famine, like same as we have today, the fact that there's plenty of food in the country, but it was shipped out, the idea that people should work for their food, work activation programs, just the same, build roads to nowhere,
That's right.
Trevelyan's corn, that kind of, that's history frames climate change in such an interesting way. The idea that you just hands off and allow the market to run, and we can see the results in that. Our history as a country is framed in it. A million people killed because we didn't want to have state intervention in an economy that was a colonizer. So it's just interesting then, and how the witch hunt feeds into this is that Angela Burke talks about how it was a case of domestic violence, but it was the way that it just people kind of thought about things in a framework of fairies and myths and other kind of Irish beliefs, because that was just the way that they were brought up. You have to kind of force those thoughts of productivity or people being just profit maximizers onto people. It's kind of something, and that's what that book, Silvia Federici, she argues that the witch hunts were part of that process of entering peasants and entering the kind of life that we had with its celebration of Imbolug, or the change in the seasons and recognising the change in the seasons because it was a more agrarian culture. The transition into a more capitalist workplace where you had people not being able to survive on the land on their own, but instead being dependent for wage employment, that kind of, and the fact that women as well would all that kind of thinking had to be forced onto people in a very brutal manner. So you had to destroy what Foucault calls the heterotopias. You had to destroy the alternative frameworks, the alternative ways of thinking, and that's who midwives and witches and women were generally the custodians for. It's something even still that you see in many countries today. If you want to control a society's culture, you control the women, and you control the women because they raise the children, they teach the children, and they, in many societies, women, in her argument anyway, it's kind of like that older women were believed to be the reservoirs of an awful lot of kind of thinking that was a challenge to the Catholic Church at the time and the Protestant Church, and also to the type of profit maximising capitalism and Protestantism that existed at the time. So
it's very interesting, the word witch hunt now in the context of particularly around when you say control the women, because if you realise in the last week the language around Me Too and that people have said, has it become a witch hunt? Has Me Too become a witch hunt?
It's interesting.
It's not just been seeing it. It's actually it's there's been articles, op-eds. They're all there, and they all go. And the word is used. It's framed as, has it become a witch hunt?
Well, it is one of those words that's been appropriated by a certain.
Oh no! It's easy to use online on Twitter. People say something, and everyone goes, "Oh, it's a witch hunt."
I don't think I've ever used it. I'm going to actually search when I go back. I don't think I've ever used the word witch.
Remember, I did a glossary
of
I did a glossary of the terms about what were used, a lynch mob, and I ran it through, and it said, because it was around the time of the George Hook controversy, and I did a glossary of the terms that were being used to criticise people who criticised George Hook.
That's right, yeah.
And it got huge traction, and one of the replies to me was, "You left out witch hunt," and I just thought I did actually, and I don't know if I did that on purpose or just.
Well, it has been jumped on in sort of Me too, and we'll take that for example. You can't tell somebody else whether they've crossed the line, and if it's their experience, they'll tell you, and you listen. That's how this works. So then you don't come back and say, "Well, I don't like you telling your experience because it's witch." No, I'm sorry. You've no hand act or part in what I do. I'm an adult. I'll say what I like.
Well, I think look again. I'm not even going to argue with anybody who says. If you feel that you've been abused, you've been abused. Because
that's it. That's the way it works.
Yeah. It's a very, very complex. Like I'm going to say, I hope I won't get witch hunted online for saying this, but like I don't like that kind of very attacking culture online. Like I kind of stay in the background a lot, but I think that the Me Too stuff has just been really, really, like, I don't know, I was watching the Golden Globes and I was kind of like all these very wealthy women going on about Me Too, and I was kind of like, but they did say that there's worse situations for women of lower economic class, but it has raised very interesting subjects about like it's very personal, obviously, sexuality and like sexual harassment is something so difficult to talk about, but kind of what is it that we class as something that is assault, and like there was one very interesting article, and it was all about kind of looking at how we internalize a lot of things, and nobody wants to claim themselves to be a victim, so you don't express things in a Me Too way, but who knows, it's a very. There are many things that ordinary women go through and put up with. We had Izzy
Kamikaze in as our second guest in here, and she said the great line she used was that if what was it, Martin? If 1 in 5 men did something that was acted inappropriate in terms in a sexually dominant way. And they did it to four women over the course of life. Every woman in the world is going to experience some form of. So, but it was just.
I don't know anyone who hasn't.
Because and I'm conscious that's my point. And we're sitting here in a room, and and two guys and a girl, and I'm conscious that we're rabbiting on. But that's the truth.
No, you're not. You're doing great. Don't worry.
Well, the other thing. We're going to have to bring this to an end, and I have to say, well, my impression, Tony. I think you're going to have to step out from the back room. I think you are one of those people that's just going to have to step out from the back room, and if we can help with the confidence end of that, love to.
There's no lack of confidence.
Because I mean, your knowledge on the environment. I mean, that's what's, as you said, and we saw it with the housing, as Lorcan and Mel told us. It's the lack of expertise where it's needed.
Yeah, and he's dead right. Like I think like, to be fair now, like coming from an activist background, obviously you focus on you want to achieve change, so you focus on your change, and there tends to be kind of a left right attack. Does that make sense? Kind of like oppositional and kind of dehumanizing. But the more kind of I'm in politics, and since learning from Occupy as well, you kind of, and from a green perspective too, like people are human. We are part of we have invented these frameworks of capitalism, and which are completely invented. They are like Karl Polanyi is another very good theorist, and he talks about the disembeddedness of our economy and disembeddedness of our society. It's been taken out of real people's lives, and real people's lives have been taken out of the planet. The enclosure movement, which is the separation of people from their earth and where they live and what they see around them, everything, and it's kind of that sort of. I think treating people, there's always going to be horrible people, and you're never going to be able to reason with them, and they're just going to be deeply misogynistic and talk on their private planes going to Davos, and it's just very very separate from the ordinary people's lives. But then you do get people on the Repeal the Eighth Committee who completely change their view, who might be in the same party, who listen to experts, and I think that's where we need to put our energies, is to basing things on facts, this kind of post-fact world, this kind of fake news, tackling that and moving. There's a brilliant book as well called Inventing the Future, and it's about how neoliberalism worked, how we're in this world where we can't even imagine alternatives, and it's because neoliberalism infiltrated itself deliberately from the kind of Hayek and others that invented it, it went into think tanks, it went into schools, it dispersed itself.
It wrote sermons for churches in the States.
Exactly, and it had a plan, and it dispersed that plan very, very effectively. And I totally agree that, you know, there needs like Jobsbridge and so on. There are people in certain parties that I would very much disagree with, and think that they need to apologise a bit. But
it's not like we haven't mentioned that here before.
But I do think that people need to be allowed to change and be directed towards that change. And how we do that is that we infiltrate again, that we spread our ideas and have that kind of game plan of a discursive left that doesn't like I went to a very interesting talk again in Stoneybatter in the Cobblestone, and it was about the social housing movements in the 70s and 60s, and like the question was asked, you know, well, what happened with the eternal splits in the left? And he said, yeah, there was always splits, like, you know, but you just work together and you achieve.
Someone else made a great point on that, and I think it's really, really, really important that we say it every time someone says, because the cliche, they say is the first thing on the agenda is the split, but the reality is there's infighting in
every
across the spectrum.
Yeah, and which is healthy and which is good.
Exactly. The dissent is
the freedom of ideas to express ideas, you know.
Well, people are trapped, and I think even very good politicians, and I think this, Tony, in all parties right across the board, they're trapped in this box that they feel they must head towards the centre all the time, and the centre is neoliberal centre.
Yeah.
It's not actual centre. Whatever was centre 40 years ago has moved significantly to the right. So now the centre is significantly over on the right. Yeah. So centre has moved.
And more importantly, status quo is not working. And it's not able to.
But it's not really the status quo.
It's
an altered status quo.
Yeah, but it's the status quo today. So the status quo today is actually not going to deliver the change that we all agree needs to happen. Whether now we're here today, we're talking climate change. I'm really conscious. I want to finish up on talking climate change because it's such an important thing that it doesn't get spoken about enough. It gets a lot of like we saw today, the announcements of regional offices, and Minister Naughton is going to launch desks for climate change in local authorities.
So there's going to be some poor person's going to be sitting at this desk, and what do you know? Well, I'm the climatologist. Yeah. And what's your desk made of? MDF and asbestos.
It's as long as look. Mood music has changed in the last fortnight out of government, but it's purely mood music.
Yeah, it is just music. Yeah,
there needs to be it needs to be what you said. It needs to be consensus. It needs to build, and it needs to be activism. It needs people coming out and actually trying to get agitated. You have to be annoyed. You can be, but you be.
We've
productive.
said it before. There's no point in just getting on Twitter, getting on Facebook, rant rave. You have got to be an activist too, and that doesn't take huge activism, small activism, even supporting others to be activists is an activism in itself.
Yeah, definitely. There's a fantastic group called Not Here, Not Anywhere, if you're interested in the oil and gas exploration, and they're looking, for example, now they're going to drill off Dalkey Coast off the 40-foot. So if you're angry about that and you think it's a terrible idea, then definitely get involved. And it's kind of, I find it is difficult to think about climate change. It seems so massive and so impossible to deal with. But there are realities that you can tackle. Like the fact the oil and gas industry is hugely dependent on subsidies. We're at a time now where oil is $50 a barrel. It's collapsed from $100 maybe two years ago. Like, this is a historic time when renewable energy is doing much, much better than oil and gas, and there are alternatives available in terms of community-owned alternative energy. We don't have to just rely on multinationals to do it. So why get involved if you can in whatever kind of green group that you see or environmental group, and also if you're involved in a political party that might be, say, for example now, Sinn Féin are doing fantastic work on fracking and on environmental issues, but they still have not moved like People for Profit to away from a kind of resource nationalism approach. And the reality is that, I think Sinn Féin and People for Profit have been fantastic on anti-racism, on anti-fascism. They are the reason why we do not have a fascist movement in Ireland. They've been brilliant. But the reality is that if you want to be anti-racist, you get involved in climate change. You say no more oil and gas, because if you say, oh well, those 10 billions of barrels of our oil will get Ireland out of austerity, it's a deeply racist idea that Ireland should profit while other countries suffer, and all along the equator ends up in drought and famine, just like Irish people during the Irish famine. You need to kind of change your perspective to a global one and combat that kind of idea. So do get involved wherever you can.
Well, thank you very. That could, yeah, I mean that.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you, and thank you for that.
Okay.